Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 16th technical seminar in our Asian Dialogue series. My name is Nasia Quintanilla, and I will be moderating this session. Today, we will be exploring Supplier Model Contract Clauses, a set of model clauses that aim to improve human rights in the apparel and textile industry. These SMCs are built upon the principles of human rights due diligence, which provide a framework for shared responsibility between buyers and suppliers and aim to put an end to unfair practices that harm workers' rights. As a fellow manufacturer working through COVID-19 pandemic, I imagine we can all relate with the stress of canceled orders, pressure of tight deadlines, delays, and back orders that wreaked havoc in our supply chain. The amount of pressure put on suppliers has always been an ongoing issue in the industry, and unfortunately was intensified during the pandemic as buyers scrambled to navigate a landscape that they had never experienced before. This uncertainty led them to really crack down on suppliers, asking for shorter lead times, more flexible order quantities, lower price points, and in some cases, even walking away from contracts. Shockingly, or maybe unshockingly, these actions were often justified by unfair contract terms that pushed suppliers to ignore the human rights of workers, creating job loss, wage theft, and many more issues. The SMCs, a brainchild of collaboration between Responsible Contracting Project and the Sustainable Terms of Trade Initiative, offer a beacon of hope. They empower suppliers to negotiate fairer terms with buyers, setting a new standard for ethical purchasing practices. These clauses aren't just words on paper. They're a catalyst for change in the industry, ensuring human rights are at the core of every transaction. Today, I have the privilege to introduce three amazing panelists who will dive into the power of these clauses and how they're reshaping the industry landscape. Before we begin, if this is your first time here, we will have the chat box open throughout the webinar. Please feel free to type any questions there, and we will have a break to go over them in the middle and at the end of our session. So, good morning, Sarah, Fatima, and Daniel. Do you mind starting with a quick round of introductions, and then we can dive deep into this?
Sure. Do you want me to start?
Yes, sorry. I
Okay,
just have to
happy
get all
to.
of that out there.
Yes, that was great. Thank you. Thank you so much also for referring to the SMCs as a beacon of hope. That's lovely. It's lovely to meet everyone. My name is Sarah Dadouche. I'm a law professor at Rutgers Law School in New Jersey in the US, and I also direct the Responsible Contracting Project, which is a global project that seeks to improve human rights in supply chains through innovative contractual solutions.
Amazing. Should we go with Daniel next?
Sure. Well, I'm Daniel Schönfelder, German business human rights lawyer and European legal advisor for the Responsible Contracting Project. Sorry, and I'm also a BHR practitioner in-house at a big German firm implementing the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. And yeah, very happy to talk to all of you today.
Nice to see you, Daniel. And good morning, Fatima. I imagine it's quite early.
Good morning, Nasia. Well, not that much actually. It's 10 a.m. in Morocco, so it's okay. So, my name is Fatima. I'm from Morocco. I used to be up till a few months ago the general manager of the Moroccan Textile and Garment Industries Association that represents basically the textile manufacturing branch in Morocco. And during that time, I was strongly involved in the Sustainable Terms of Trade initiative as the representative of one of the associations involved in the whole reflection that started after COVID, basically. And today, I'm an independent expert. I work with companies, Moroccan manufacturers, to support them in their development strategies and in coping with all the pressures that they have in the current environment in terms of orders and sustainable purchasing practices and preserving workers right within the companies given the current context we're evolving in today. So thank you for having me today.
No, I'm excited. I know there's a lot of changes, especially after COVID, in the manufacturing landscape. So I'm excited to dive into these contract clauses. So if we'd like to get started.
Shall I go ahead and try and share my screen?
Sure, no problem.
Okay, let me see. Oh, sorry. Of course, it's like behind the share screen thing. Here we go. Okay, so I thought I would just start by giving just a teeny bit of background on responsible contracting project. So one of the key points about our work is that we produce these innovative contractual solutions, practices for improving human rights in supply chains, and we root everything that we do in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Business Conduct. And that means that all of the tools that we are preparing are due diligence aligned, just at their core. That is what they are set up to do. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is that all of our goods, all of our tools are available open access for free on our website. And we warmly invite you to visit our website, responsiblecontracting.org, and take advantage of all these things that are there for you. And our sort of mission is beyond just preparing these model clauses. We're also very focused on uptake and implementation of the tools that we produce, and very always receptive to feedback. All the tools that we have are iterative, which means that they are always up for a version 2.0 or a version 3.0 based on everybody's input. So with that, I thought I would just start with a little bit of explanation of why we think contracts matter, and how contracting as usually gets a lot of things wrong, and then pass it on to Daniel to talk about how contracts fit into mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence frameworks. So the reason that we pay attention to contracts so deeply is because we understand that contracts are essentially the legal links of the supply chain that connect the different actors of the supply chain together. They are the most often used tools for managing human rights and environmental risks because companies, buyers, brands see the contracts as a way to get their human rights or environmental policies implemented across their supply chains. If those policies are just sitting in their drawer, they're not doing anything. But once they get embedded into contracts and moving down the supply chain, that's how they get implementation of their policies throughout the supply chain. So contracts are very often used and for this purpose. But they are used in ways that are often very problematic, that actually compromise the trust building and the collaboration between brands and their suppliers in ways that I will explain. So they are, the most often used tools for managing supply chain risks and for human rights and environmental risks. This is what companies are doing more and more, is using their contracts in this way. But the way that they use their contracts is typically to say, supplier, you are solely responsible for upholding our human rights standards, for adhering to our supplier code of conduct. And if anything goes wrong, we can terminate. This is what is known as sort of a risk shifting contract. And from our perspective, risk shifting is completely different from risk management. And this is a message that we are really working to get out to brands and suppliers alike, is that just shifting the risk is not the same thing as managing it. And so these contracts that use these traditional methods of, okay, supplier, you are solely responsible. You have to promise, guarantee that there is no unpaid overtime workers in your supply chain, that everything in the factory is pristine, all the fire exits are cleared, there is no child labor, there is no forced labor, there is no discrimination issues. All of this you have to guarantee. These kinds of promises are completely unrealistic, because everybody knows that every supply chain is going to have human rights issues somewhere. And this is the same, by the way, if we're talking about production countries or we're talking about countries within, for example, the European Union. There are human rights issues everywhere. Even like paying different amounts of money to women and men is a form of discrimination. So that is a human rights issue. So there are issues up and down. And so to have these unrealistic promises is actually unhelpful. And it's also dangerous because when you have these unrealistic promises combined with, and if anything goes wrong, we're out, we're going to cancel the contract, that really undermines the ability of the buyer and the supplier to cooperate, collaborate, to solve problems as they arise. Instead, it creates a real adversariality and a sort of pressured and feared relationship between the two actors. The other thing about contracting as usual, you all know it, I won't spend too much time on it, is that they say nothing about the buyer's responsibility to engage in responsible purchasing practices that can actually support the supplier's ability to uphold human rights and meet the requirements of the supplier codes of conduct. One of the complaints that we hear the most often from suppliers is that brands want gold human rights standards, but they're not even willing to pay bronze prices. And the last issue with contracting as usual, these risk-shifting contracts as well, is that they tend to say, okay, if there is a human rights issue, buyer will cancel the contract. It is a breach of contract. We get to leave, suspend payments to you, not pay you at all, sue you potentially for damages, etc. And this actually does nothing to repair the harm to the victims of the human rights violation or issue, which is again a mismatch for contracting as usual in terms of being actually due diligence aligned. So, oh, I don't know why I've somehow, hold on, no, I've gone into some other mode where, wait, what if I do that? I can no longer control my slides. Hold on, let me try stopping and starting again. Apologies. It went into some kind of pen function. Okay, let's try that. Okay, so traditional contracts, these risk-shifting contracts are not effective. And as you may or may not know, effectiveness is now becoming a real issue. Until now, effectiveness has been a real voluntary matter. Companies could have these beautiful human rights policies, impose them on their suppliers, and then not have anything actually to verify that the policies are working. But now, with the emergence of mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, HRDD, we have a shift from the voluntary to the mandatory, which means that companies that are going to be in scope for the legislation, already the one existing in Germany, but the one also coming at the EU level, are going to have to think about how are my contracts effective and how are my purchasing practices effective for preventing the occurrence of human rights violations and adverse human rights impacts. And so this is really a time, in my view, and the views of our team at the Responsible Contracting Project, is that this is actually a very important time for apparel suppliers to look at how they can improve the terms that they have with their buyers, because now there is an expectation coming from legislation that buyers do better. And so we have these three core principles, which are due diligence aligned, which would, if incorporated into contracts, would allow those contracts to be due diligence aligned. And the first is to move away from these one-sided promises toward a shared commitment between buyers and sellers to cooperate in carrying out human rights due diligence. Second, for the buyer to commit to engage in responsible purchasing practices that can actually support effective due diligence. And third, to prioritize human rights remediation over traditional remedies. This is a side-by-side view. I'm not going to spend time on it, but our slides will be available for you, so you can read these at your leisure. The one transition that I want to make before passing it on to Daniel is that we have now these three core principles that have been embedded into this new tool, which is the Supplier Model Contract Clauses, which, as Nasia and Fatima said, we developed at the request of the suppliers who are members of the Sustainable Terms of Trade Initiative. And we did this in the wake of all the COVID cancellations and the tremendously negatively impactful behavior of brands in time of pandemic. And so we have these model clauses. They take the EU legislative backdrop into account, and our hope is that you can use them to actually lobby your brands, your buyers, for better terms, because these are due diligence aligned terms. So with that, I'll just pass it on to Daniel to speak a little bit about due diligence aligned contracting and the legislation.
Well, thank you. So what some firms might think, like, okay, this is nice, convincing, yeah, this is needed for good due diligence. But what in the end matters for many firms is not making the world a better place, unfortunately, but upholding legal requirements, and also not, especially if it's things like those we talk about that could affect profits, because you have to pay higher prices to suppliers. So we were very happy about the German Supply Chain Act and about its interpretation by BAFA, the regulator that enforces it. Because if you look at the LKSG and also on the CSDDD, they do address these topics. They talk about an obligation as part of preventive measures to have contractual assurances by your suppliers. But if you look at the guidance, especially the guidance on collaboration in supply chains by the BAFA and the helpdesk, I will put the link in the chat in a minute, you can see that this is being interpreted in a way that is quite related to our principles, because they say basically you have to have effective and appropriate measures also when it comes to contracts. And this abstract principle concretes to many concrete interesting things mentioned in the guidance. For example, they say you cannot just transfer the responsibility for HRDD to your suppliers, or the costs of HRDD to your suppliers. That doesn't mean that you cannot create new obligations for your suppliers. This is necessary for human rights and environmental due diligence, that you tell them, okay, we will do a risk analysis together. We will take measures together. So you have to make our remedial mechanism accessible and so on. It means that you cannot just take everything of your obligations and give it to the supplier and say, now you go live with it, live happy life with all these obligations, and we are out of it. You have to oblige them to participate in your due diligence, but you cannot shift your own due diligence obligation related to your supply chain away from yourself. You also have to look at the costs of human rights due diligence, and in the interpretation of the BAFA and the helpdesk guidance, it even says you have to appropriately share the costs of measures. For example, if you tell your supplier, please introduce an environmental management system to fulfill these obligations, depending on what kind of share of the cost of the sales of the supplier you have. And if you already pay fair prices, you should also pay a share of the costs for these measures, according to the guidance, which we believe is very convincing. If we can move on to the next slide. Another interesting point taken up by German contract law, by the CSDDD, by the guidance, contract terms must be fair and non-discriminatory, especially when it comes to SMEs. So in relation to SMEs, both the CSDDD and the guidance by the BAFA is the regulator, the institution in charge of enforcing the German Supply Chain Act. So they can issue guidance on how to interpret the law, how to understand it. Both say that when you are working with SME suppliers, you have to be specifically careful, because SMEs can be very good at human rights due diligence. They can, because they have smaller supply chains, less suppliers. They can really effectively do due diligence, but many times it's also harder for them. I mean, they can have an interesting form of leverage, but for example, they don't have in-house legal counsel, human rights counsel. Human rights counsel is a new thing coming up in many German firms. I'm also like human rights counsel in the firm. You don't have this internal expertise, you don't have the leverage, you don't have the financial means. So you have to do something, but the buying firm should accompany you very closely. It doesn't apply for every SME. There's a fabulous SME, Hakro, a textile firm in Germany, which is absolutely amazing in all of this, in my view. I don't know, maybe I've had other experiences with them, but my view is that they do it very well. Especially, well, this is how they talk about their work. I think it's convincing. Maybe, yeah, practice is different, but it seems very, very, very cool. So there are SMEs that can do this very strongly. Hakro says, yeah, we have 10 suppliers. We manage them very closely and work together with them. The other thing is purchasing practices. Purchasing practices is a part of the obligations of the German Supply Chain Act. It's in there, mentioned specifically. In the CSDDD as well, a bit more complex, but as well, it's mentioned. So here, it is important and pointed out by the German regulator. What does this mean? They have a very nice info box 7 in the guidance that I will also share the link of. That is like 10 questions on purchasing practices that you have to follow as a buying company. For example, prices that take into account sustainability costs. It's very nice stuff. It's a quick read, and you can use it then in the negotiations with your buying firms always. And if you're a buying firm, you can read it, and this is what you should assess your purchasing practices on. You have to assess not only the risks that are in your supply chain, but the risks that you create with your purchasing practices. Because if you set the incentive only to price and quality, you are creating risks. You have to analyze the risk, prioritize, and then say, okay, for example, a low wage sector, I'm procuring here from a low wage sector. Here I have to zoom in on prices, do ring fencing labor costs. Without enabling suppliers to pay living wages, they cannot do it. And then exit as a last resort is also something being taken up by both the CSDDD, the LKSG, in the interpretation also of the guidance, official guidance. It's a last resort. You have to analyze the impact that you create. Termination doesn't necessarily make anything better, although it's important to have termination rights to make it clear that human rights is a serious topic. It's no feel-good topic, but it's not the first go-to option. You should give your supplier the chance to do better, and you have to really evaluate if it in the end helps workers or not to terminate the business relationship. Can we go on? And
this we can do quite quickly because I
mean, this slide is just about all these requirements can feel overwhelming for buying firms, for supplying firms. Remember, HRDD is not about perfection. It's about knowing your problems and then creating a pathway to step-by-step transformation. That's what this slide is about. And it applies to our tools as well. Start by saying, yes, shared responsibility, maybe then develop to really committing to responsible purchasing, maybe then someday develop to also committing to worker rights and contracts. But yeah, that's just that. I think we can move on.
Thank you. So I think we'll pause here and pass it back to you, Nasia.
I mean, coming from a supplier background, my first reaction would be like, sign me up. Where is this contract? Let me sign it. Let me push it. But of course, at the same time, you know, the competition for suppliers is very real. And I would love to hear Fatima's input in regards to, I mean, from a supplier, of course, this is amazing and this is like the ideal contract, but in reality, you know, how much can you push a brand to meet you halfway or even fully there without kind of being scared of losing their business, and if this is a conversation that's been had or not. So it'd be really interesting to hear your side, Fatima, in regards to Morocco and your suppliers.
Thank you, Nasia. Yeah, like you said, it's very difficult as a supplier to voice your concern to your customers, to the buyers in front of you, because there's always fear of retaliation. And even when I was in the Moroccan Textile Association, even as an association, it is difficult to voice concern on your own because you're worried, you're afraid that it will have an impact on your member companies and the manufacturers in your country. So this is why AMIT, the Moroccan Association at that time, joined STTI, because STTI was basically a group of associations all over the world that were strongly impacted by the COVID crisis and the behavior, the purchasing practices of buyers at that time, brands and retailers at that time. And we thought and we felt more comfortable getting together and voicing the same concerns that we had as a group. It's like you're saying, safety in numbers. We thought at that time that getting together and talking about the issues that our manufacturers were facing as a group would be effective. And one of the output that we had from the discussions at that time was the fact that, unfortunately, I mean, we're talking about contracts. Unfortunately, a lot of brands and retailers don't use contracts. It turns out when you speak to manufacturers that they would get orders by email, on a phone call. And in that sense, there were no actually written contracts on which you could actually build if there is a problem. That was the first point. The second point was that, and it was mentioned earlier, manufacturers don't have the means to have a strong legal team internally to handle contracts when they exist. I mean, there's no way you can compare the legal leverage of a manufacturer with the legal leverage of a brand or a retailer. There's a total imbalance of powers in this. So this is where the idea came up within STTI at that time to somehow draft some standard clauses or contracts that manufacturers could be able to use and enforce with their brands and retailers and their customers in order to reduce the imbalance between brands, retailers on one side and suppliers on the other side. So that was initially the idea. So when we go over the clauses that were mentioned and the spirit of the work that's been done so far by Daniel and Sarah, like you said, where do I sign? I mean, this is something that is definitely needed. It was mentioned also earlier by Sarah, the European legislation and everything that is happening in terms of regulation all over the world to make sure that we protect the human rights and the environment in the production process of the textile industry. And Daniel mentioned a very good point, which is collaboration. I remember when the EU started pushing for that legislation and talking about that legislation. Of course, we within STTI were very happy about it because this is something that we've been calling for so long. But we had one worry, and here I will quote one of the STTI participants who used that very strong comparison, saying we need to be careful that this legislation does not turn out as throwing a live grenade down the value chain to the suppliers. And this is what Sarah and Daniel mentioned earlier. It shouldn't be, brands and retailers shouldn't be taking that regulation and just shove it down to the suppliers and expecting them to abide by these new regulations on their own. It should be a collaboration between brands and suppliers in order to make sure that the whole value chain actually complies. And unfortunately, I have to say what we've been seeing up to now is this adverse effect where you have brands and retailers coming into suppliers and saying, okay, this is the regulation. You need to comply with that regulation because if you don't, well, we just cut orders and take the orders to someone else. It would be okay if we had a fair environment where, like Daniel mentioned earlier, fair price. I mean, you shouldn't be able to, as a buyer, to just expect your suppliers to comply with the regulation, to make additional investment when needed. And I come back to that, all these audits that are pushed down on suppliers in order to be compliant with the regulation and not pay an additional premium in order to cover those costs. And effectively what we're seeing today is increased pressure on suppliers for more compliance on a social and environmental level. But at the same time, we're saying prices going down. Prices that were not fair before, they were not fair because if you go back to some studies, one of them is the study that was done by the Aberdeen University earlier this year, around January, February, was published. It appeared, I mean, it showed on that study that buyers were not paying the fair price. Some of them were even paying below cost, and they knew it. And because the situation was very difficult for the factories, especially after COVID, they needed to get work into the production lines. They needed to get salaries paid and so on. They were accepting whatever prices brands and retailers were imposing on them just to survive. But guess what? Who's paying the ultimate price at the end of the day? It's the worker, because they're not paying extra hours. They're not paying minimum wage. Social Security, forget about it, because the companies, the suppliers didn't have the money to do that, because buyers didn't want to pay the fair price. And what's happening today, and I hear that a lot from some of the suppliers around me, is that they're pushing on them new certifications, social certifications, environmental certifications, and so on. And they're telling the suppliers, well, you have to bear the cost. My purchasing price is going to be the same, if not lower, because of declining demand, overall demand for garments in the world, because they have a lot of inventory, because of inflation and so on. Customers are not willing to pay more for clothing. They're actually buying less clothing. And because of all that, well, the only answer that we get from brands and retailers is, guys, okay, you want the order, well, you have to cut the prices even more than they were before. But at the same time, you need to comply. And the other problem that we find, and I think we've talked about it several times before, is that the people responsible for sustainability in general, social and environmental sustainability within the brands and the retailers is not the same team that is responsible for the buying process. So when you have the sustainability people pushing for more compliance on the supplier side, you have the buying team that is pushing for lower prices, and that can't match. We do have a problem within the companies, the buyers, and the buyers, the brands and the retailers, we do have an internal problem inside those companies. And what happens is that some manufacturers, some suppliers would accept orders with very low prices, knowing that it's not going to cover the wages and so on, because they don't have a choice. They're back to a wall, so they have to take that order. But then, unexpectedly, you have some guy from the sustainability team coming in for an audit and realizing that, well, maybe minimum wages are not paid, social security is not paid, and so on. So he's going to blacklist that factory. So when the factory manager calls the buyer, because that's the only person he's in touch with within the company, and says, okay, I have a problem. The price that you quoted me does not allow me to do that. And I got caught by the sustainability and they want to blacklist me. Say, I don't care. Solve your problems with them. So you don't even have a support, or nobody takes responsibility for the unfair behavior that we see today happening actually effectively on the ground. So yes, better contract clauses, that's great. But if if buyers don't share the responsibility and don't work with the suppliers in a win-win deal, it's not gonna work. It's the cycle is gonna keep repeating itself at the expense of the workers at the end of the value chain. And what brands and retailers need to realize really very quickly, because they haven't realized that yet, what they need to realize very quickly is that their survival, their success depends on their supplier's survival. The way they're behaving today is they're killing their suppliers. And if they lose their supplier base, well, they won't have anywhere else to produce their product that they're selling. And what is, I would say, encouraging for us today is that all the supplying countries, all the countries that have a manufacturing base are on the same page. We're all saying the same thing. This has to stop. So brands and retailers with unfair practices cannot anymore jump from one country to the other, hoping that their bad practices that they had in one country will not be heard of in other countries. Now we know, everybody knows. And some do not even hesitate to go on name and shame campaigns so that everybody knows the buying practices of some brands and retailers, and it prevents these brands and retailers from reproducing the same negative cycle in other countries.
I mean,
I'll stop there.
Well, it's interesting because, in the history of this industry, I mean, I think this is the first time really that suppliers don't see each other as just purely competition and keeping trade secrets, and they're starting to really start having big conversations on how they're being treated. And at the same time, this is the most transparent the supply chain has been due to all of these changes, and becoming the customer becoming more aware of wanting to see where their textiles are coming from. But at the same time, all of these, sustainable terms are being put in place while fast fashion is still very strong, and all of these demands are being put on the supplier, and it's just constant pressure. And I mean, personally speaking, working through COVID at the factory that I worked in, the orders didn't stop, they slowed down. And technically, our factory was supposed to be closed, and many factories were supposed to be closed due to the pandemic. And there was no option. The workers had to keep working because the deadlines were still there. And, for maybe the middle management, it's just a loss in sales quarters. But for the workers, it's their livelihood and it's their health, you know? So you really see how it affects the supply chain to a lifestyle level. And for a long time, I think suppliers and, their buyers have had, I don't want to say like a toxic relationship, but a very volatile and fragile one. And now, having these terms to be able to put on paper and to really just follow through with is interesting, but at the same time, how, how willing are these brands going to be, do you think, Sarah, to put this on paper and say, yes, we will take on this level of risk because we want to make sure that the supply chain for us is as clean as it can be?
Yeah.
Nasia, Sarah, excuse me, I just wanted to react to something that Nasia just said.
Yeah.
Just a quick comment. I think it is very good that for quite some time now, since COVID, since the inception of STTI and so on, a lot of people have taken up this issue of human rights due diligence. And I think it's very good in the sense, it's very positive in the sense that it allows everybody to have a different perspective on what's happening really in the manufacturing countries. Because every time we had a problem, a catastrophe, human rights catastrophe in one of the manufacturing sites, it was always depicted in the press and all over the place as the fault of the suppliers, of the fault of a country that didn't apply human rights and didn't make sure that human rights were preserved within the factories. So it was always the factories, the manufacturers that were that we pointed fingers at, saying they're the bad guys. But what's been happening for the past 2 to 3 years is that suppliers had the opportunity, maybe for the first time, to actually give their side of the story and say, okay, guys, I mean, we don't take pleasure in not paying minimum wage. It's just that we can't. It's a common responsibility. It's a shared responsibility between brands and suppliers. So we need to work together to find an equilibrium that would guarantee transparency and safety to everyone throughout the value chain. So I think that's a very positive point now, because people are starting to really realize it's way more complicated than just manufacturers not respecting human rights in their factories and just wanting to put more money into their pockets. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree that I think, a major impact of making human rights and environmental due diligence a mandatory requirement is that we are shifting the focus to the buyers, to the brands. We're looking at what is the responsibility of the corporation at the head of the supply chain. And I really think, Nasia, in answer to your question, that is the biggest reason why companies are now paying attention in a different way to their contracts, because they understand. We know this from already the German due diligence legislation is in place. We know, based on our lived experience, companies are reaching out to us, asking us, can you help us, do a gap analysis between our contracts and the LKS, the German due diligence law, or between the contracts and your clauses, which are due diligence aligned. So we know that when things become legislated, when requirements become mandatory, it completely shifts the conversation. In the US, there is not mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation. There are, however, trade sanctions regimes that do affect the apparel sector quite extensively. And for those, for companies that are affected by those laws, contracts also play a very important role, because the most important or the most effective way really of not getting your goods withheld at the border for problems of forced labor is to prevent forced labor from happening in your supply chain. And the best way to do that is to carry out human rights and environmental due diligence. And the best way to do that is to collaborate with your suppliers and have better, more cooperative relationship with your suppliers, where more information is moving with more trust and solution-oriented mentality. Daniel, I don't know if you want to add something to that, or?
Yeah, with pleasure. Because also there was a question in the chat by Josef Strasser from Adelphi. I think it adds up good to this. And because the question was like kind of how realistic is this? There's many dimensions to this question. The first one is how realistic is the past approach? I think the past approach is very unrealistic. You're creating a parallel reality with the past approach. I mean, this is law always creates parallel realities or new realities. But in the past approach, you create a new reality that's very far from the truth. So I think the past approach of passing all on to the supplier is utterly unrealistic. Now, let's think about this new reality, which we might move into, and how to move in that. And how realistic is this new reality, or how concrete can it be, the one that we are describing here, Sarah, Fatima, and I? Well, I mean, it's not about perfection. It's not about like you cannot, let's say, I work at a firm where we have many different suppliers, and many of our suppliers might be more powerful in the concrete business relationship that we have than they are. In textile, it's often more clear cut because it's kind of typical. The brand has a lot of power than tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. I mean, the power dynamics are complex and different also in every textile supply chain, but typically the brand will be the very powerful force. But now, what should I do as a company, as a buying company? If I say I will do fair pricing everywhere and will put price escalation clause in all our contracts, maybe this will really be a problem for me. Economically, internally, the purchasing team will say, no, we don't want to go bankrupt. We cannot just give away free lunches to everyone. So the answer is prioritization. You have to do a risk analysis of your own purchasing practices. And then you have to take the conscious and hard decisions of where to go first. You cannot go everywhere all at once. You cannot, for example, from day 1 to year 1, establish really 100% living wages. I don't think it's possible. You can just define pathways where you move towards this. So the answer is, if you have tens of thousands of suppliers, you have to prioritize the risks, not only the risk profile of the suppliers, but the risk profile, the risks that you create with your purchasing. They are mainly for wages, for health and safety, also for environmental due diligence, stuff that requires investment, financial investment by the supplier, or working hours, for example, also big risk. There's an interesting study on this by the Better Buying Institute, kind of summed up all studies that were there at the beginning of the year and said these are the typical risks affected by your purchasing practices. So you should look at this study or other, maybe there's better studies than this, if there are, if anyone knows one, please post it. I will post the Better Buying study also in a minute. Start with that, look at your categories of purchasing that you have, build a risk structure of your purchasing operations, and start with the highest risk ones to change the situation. But the thing is, in textile, I think many things are high risk. It's basically a high risk supply chain. So yes, it becomes tougher in textile. So for example, again, citing Siemens, I posted some examples of companies actually moving on this in the chat. Siemens, S. Oliver, Hapag-Lloyd from shipping. Well, at least on paper. No, I cannot say, oh, here's the Daniel Schoenfelder certificate, they are perfect responsible contracting stuff. No, on paper, in the public documents, they commit to nice stuff. But where was I going at? Yeah, Siemens has living wage goals in the supply chain, and they don't say next year everyone will get a living wage from our suppliers, because it's not possible. So, and it's more complex than that, of course, because yes, you say, okay, you have a prioritization, abstract risk, you can start, but then you have to talk to your suppliers. What's realistic? How much can you pay me? How much would it cost if your workers would get a living wage? I was talking to a food company the other day, and that's a similar problem, interesting problems. In Spain, basically, the workers are exploited as forced labor almost in the berry sector, in the berry picking sector. And now German firms are starting to think about, but what should we do? And they assess the risk, and they're like, they don't have the financial capacity to pay the workers. Now, ask your suppliers, calculate together with them what would be a fair price, how much higher would the price need to be, and then maybe you don't start paying that price tomorrow because you can't, but you create also a pathway in which you pay more and more, and the suppliers have to pay more and more to the workers, for example, rising both at the same time. These are kind of the ideas and approaches I would recommend here, but take an informed decision. Analyze the risk and say where you will focus first, document this, and start.
In the same breath, do you think, maybe Fatima, this would be a good question for you from your experience, that maybe bigger suppliers or bigger manufacturers would be more keen to implement these clauses in their contracts, or would it be maybe the smaller suppliers who would feel more protected by this?
I think there won't be any difference. I mean, I'm talking again about the case of Morocco that I know very well. And what I've seen is small and large companies don't have contracts because brands and retailers work with no contracts. It's just orders that are passed on. So today, all of them, big and smaller companies, all of them are willing to work with these clauses and to work with contracts, formal contracts, in order to get also protected, because that was not the case. I mean, the difficult times that these suppliers have been through throughout the COVID period are still very vivid in their memories. I mean, you mentioned, Nasia, earlier that in the factory you were working in, orders didn't stop. Well, in Morocco, orders stopped overnight. We went from hundreds of thousands of garments produced to stop everything overnight. And it was a nightmare for all of us at that time. So, and it's not only that the orders stopped, but a lot of brands and retailers at that time suspended payments, canceled orders and said, we're not going to pay for it, or waited until you ship the order to tell you, okay, now I'm going to impose a discount because my stores are closed. Nobody's going to buy my clothes. So I'm going to lose money. So I'll pass it on to you. So it is very important today to understand that all suppliers, no matter what their size is, okay, maybe the big ones would have a slightly bigger bargaining power in terms of their relation with the buyers because they're big, they are more important, if I would say, to the brands and retailers than the smaller ones that are easily expendable because you can find another small one. It's not a big deal. But all of them share the same feeling that they need more protection. When we talk about minimum wage and social rights and so on, in Morocco, honestly, it's not an issue. It's not an issue in the sense that we have one of the highest minimum wages in the area, and it keeps increasing. We also had a raise very recently in September, another increase, and there's another one coming on next year, because that's the policy of the government, improve people's living condition. So we know, and that's not going to change, that the minimum wage in Morocco needs to be paid. We have right now, they're generalizing Social Security as well to allow people to go to hospitals and have health insurance. That's becoming mandatory. So that's not an issue. The issue is if brands and retailers keep pushing prices down, factories won't be able to pay for that. And if they're not able to pay for that, the ones who are going to be suffering at the end of the day is the workers. Because if the company, the supplier, don't pay Social Security on the day they're sick and they go to the hospital, well, they tell them we can't do anything for you because your employer didn't pay Social Security. And then again, we will point fingers at the employer, forgetting that if he didn't pay, it's because someone else, the ultimate brand and retailer that put the order in the first place, didn't pay a fake price. So this is something that all suppliers, no matter what their size is, to go back to your question, are looking forward to, because that protects them and that protects their workers as well.
Do you think it will be easy? I mean, I guess after having a relationship where I mean, really is built on trust where there's no contract, that it will be easy for the suppliers to just say, hey, listen, like, here's a contract. We're not doing this anymore. Or do you think brands are going to try to like push back a little bit or kind of slow it down?
Can I speak to that just briefly? So one thing to highlight is that, you know, even if it's an email purchase order or an email on its own with like quantity, I need it by this time, that is a contractual document. So it is that is the and I've checked also with civil law folks, and it is a contract. And one other thought is that I think typically, if I understand, to the extent that their companies may not be using written contracts that look like what we would expect a contract to look like, are they also asking the supplier to sign a code of conduct as well, right? So between those two things, you have the beginnings, if not an actual sort of fuller contract with respect to the human rights expectations of the suppliers. As far as Nasia, your question, if the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, the EU directive, goes through as is, the requirement will be that companies obtain contractual assurances from their suppliers that their suppliers are participating in their due diligence process. It isn't exactly that wording, but it's something like this. So I think we can expect to see more fleshed out contracts going forward because it's a legal requirement, but also because that is going to be like something that companies can point to and say, look, we have a contract with our supplier and blah. And so it's around legal compliance, but it's also a way for the buyer to say, okay, supplier, I needed you to report to me on this information by this date. This is now a specific contractual term that I need to get you to perform so that I can comply with the legislation.
But then, Sarah, that brings a question. What if the supplier provides all the information on salaries that are paid and
Yes.
Safety, compliance, and so on and so forth, and yet the price that the buyer is paying does not cover these costs?
Yeah.
What's the
well, this is what Daniel was explaining. In the German due diligence law, it's laid out pretty clearly that purchasing practices have to be evaluated. Purchasing practices, including pricing, prominently have to be evaluated as a preventive measure. They have to be appropriate. So if you are paying a price that everybody knows does not cover the cost of responsible business conduct, or let alone a living wage, then that is going to be an issue for compliance. So I think that the challenge then becomes, how do you contractualize that? But that's actually not a very difficult challenge to meet. The requirement is coming from the legislation. Daniel.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that, like it's complex, and the question also of the transparency. I mean, I wanted to add one thing on the contract, the written contract. Yeah, legally also in Germany, an email is a contract. But I can understand Fatima's point, because the supplier wants security and definition. He wants to be able to tell the buyer, okay, you committed to this, and that. What did you do? No, it's not written out. He wants to be able to go to the bank and say, look, I have a big, good contract with a big German firm. Give me a credit so I can improve my facilities. All this is not facilitated by a mere email. So I do think it's part of, for me, responsible purchasing practices, that you give the supplier a well-defined contract, because it's like, responsible purchasing is not possible without responsible contracting. They are the same thing, kind of. If you only speak about your practices and you also practice them, it's a lot less effective, because responsible purchasing practice is about strengthening the capacity of the supplier and giving him the security that he needs to invest, to improve, and to plan for living wages, for investment in facilities, and so on. So I really think it's a very important point. And the other point, what was the other point? The last point? Sorry.
Price.
Price. Yeah, price. Oh, I had a very interesting discussion on that with the supplier, with supplier representatives, and with Z-Man. So we have in our SMCs a clause that says, do open costing. Yeah, do open costing by a supplier, and then be fair about the cost sharing of the open costing. We thought it's a brilliant idea. I also like the idea, but I got a counter argument from a supplier the other day. Very interesting counter argument. They said, this is all fine, but you know what some buyers do? They would say, okay, let's do open costing. Then they ask supplier A, B, C, D, E, and then they take out the ones that are costlier and use this open costing, and would misuse this open costing opportunity that we provide in our SMCs to really abuse, because this would be, again, irresponsible purchasing practice. Now you can say, oh, it's prohibited, they wouldn't do it, but they do many things if there is no one watching. So that's also a big issue. But Z-Man had they had very many interesting approaches to all of this. He told me also the issue of living wages. Thing is, if I now as a buyer tell the supplier pay living wages, then 3 years later the contract is over. I gave them fair price and so on, and it's all fine, no? And they increased them, and theoretically. But then after the 3 years, the buyer moves on because the supplier is more expensive, and because he finds a cheaper supplier, and now the supplier is stuck with the living wages because under employment law in many countries, in Germany at least, and also in Bangladesh, as the supplier was telling me, if you increase the wages, you cannot just decrease the wages. So what Z-Man does is trying to establish workarounds, no, with paying bonus schemes. The living wage is not part of the normal wage, but kind of a bonus system. I thought that was clever, but who knows if it will uphold in employment courts. But yeah, it's all very complex and interesting. So just wanted to add those thoughts on open costing, living wage, and contracts.
One other piece, and I think we probably need to wrap up, but is that in addition, one of the things that is folded into responsible purchasing practices is also that the buyer should provide support and assistance, in particular to SMEs, to meet the buyer's own human rights standards or code of conduct. So those two, and that assistance can be, and we have a contract clause around that. That assistance can be financial or not, right? It can be around training and equipping with software and things like this. One last thing I just wanted to share, because we didn't actually go into it, but is the menu of the SMCs that you can again find open access for free on our website. And I highlighted in red some that I thought we might get to, but I don't think we're gonna have time. But you'll see that we have some very specific to apparel around samples, for example. But we have clauses on responsible pricing, clauses on reasonable assistance. The recognition one is very, I think, important, as more and more suppliers can expect to see more due diligence requirements put on them. You're probably going to be receiving a lot more questionnaires from your buyers, a lot more documents to fill out to show that you're up to speed and you're a safe supplier to work with. The recognition provision 3.13, this one, is there to say buyers should coordinate and buyers should produce questionnaires in a way that minimizes the burden on suppliers and coordinate to the extent possible with other buyers to accept their questionnaires as satisfactory for their own purposes. And we have, of course, a provision based, largely from the COVID experience on responsible exit. So those are just a couple that I wanted to highlight. And the last one to highlight is we have one that is suppliers' responsibilities as buyers, which essentially says that when supplier wears a buyer hat in its own contracts, it should also assume the responsibilities of engaging in responsible purchasing practices and all the things that we want your brands, your buyers to observe. So, quick overview of the thing, but I hope that helps a little bit, Nasia.
No, that did help a lot. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. But I do have to say, I mean, it is amazing that we can even have this conversation. I think that's in itself like a very positive step. I don't think 10 years ago people would be having these conversations. So we're already kind of in the right direction, and hopefully we can meet in real time and pop champagne and celebrate once these contracts are just a daily normal situation in every factory. But thank you so much for your time today and all of this information. I really appreciate it.
Nasa, if I may, I just have one quick something to say quickly. We've been focusing on prices in the start of the discussion because it is probably on the supplier side and also on the buyer side a very important point. But I think there are other ways in which brands and retailers can implement more sustainable purchasing practices. One of them is planification. What we're seeing today is a very hectic flow of orders throughout the year where you could have periods where you're flooded with orders, where you make people work overtime, where you, like Sarah said, you become yourself a buyer because you need to subcontract part of the order because you don't have the capacity internally and so on. And we've lived that on several periods where it is just crazy. And then the following period, nothing. And it could go on for weeks and months where you don't have a single order. That's not sustainable in the long term. So if buyers and brands and retailers could make an effort to better planify the orders throughout the year, that could help a lot also mitigate the risk on human rights due diligence. That's one thing. And the second thing is to create a safe environment where suppliers can express their concerns. Today, the only contact they have with the brand is the buyer, who only cares about prices. They don't have any contact with the sustainability department except when they send external auditors to come and check if you're compliant with all their standards. So I don't know how, but I don't think that's very costly for brands and retailers to do, is just to set up a safe channel of communication between suppliers and the brand in order to voice concerns and work together in order to improve the overall situation without getting into a fight, without getting into termination of contracts, without I don't know. There must be a way, and it doesn't cost a lot of money. It doesn't involve prices to implement better purchasing practices aside from the price notion. That's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that because the last point, it's something that German companies are, for example, starting to do, and I believe this could in the future be a best practice. The end point of the risk analysis, where you know in the end, okay, 50 of our suppliers are high risk. What do we do now? We talk with them. We have a call with them like we are having today. We send them before. We actually assess the situation based on our info. You have high risk for 1 to 3. We want to talk with you about that. Maybe we are missing something. Maybe you already have measures. Maybe if you don't, but that's no problem. We have some ideas for measures that we can discuss. Let's create a realistic pathway. Let's do a corrective action plan. We don't have to audit you for that. It's more expensive for both of us. I mean, that's the thing. you have to create, but for this to work, you have to create the atmosphere where the supplier can really talk about problems. So you have to have the contracts right. You have to tell them, if there's a problem, we will find solutions together. That's the approach that I will be testing in the following months. Like in my other corporate role, I will be in charge of exactly this process. We will have a lot of supplier talks. And yeah, I'm curious how this will work. We don't audit so much. We audit as well, of course, but we want to focus on this more collaborative speaking with each other approach. And I hope that it could be a pathway to a better practice of controlling and collaborating with the supplier. Because I mean, you can in such discussions see like, okay, you don't have a good answer. Well, apparently you don't really do this thing well. So let's talk about how you can do it better. I mean, it's you can in such conversations also find out a lot, but work together to improve.
It would be great, you know, in a year from now, hopefully, ideally, in a perfect world, to come back to this conversation and have the same, you know, call and just see where we're at a year because, you know, I mean, we all know that the supply chain doesn't work that fast unless but if we are moving in this direction, it should be something that is prioritized and hopefully will be, especially now that, you know, governments are getting involved. But I think that's just kind of my 2 cents there. And I should probably start wrapping this up and letting you guys free because I know you guys must have a busy day. Um, but I very much appreciate your time today, and I really feel like we are overall going through a very positive direction, but also a very realistic one, hopefully, you know, because there's been a lot of situations where it's just okay, this is especially as a supplier, maybe Fatima understands this. But this does feel, you know, very rooted in like logic and in a way that's protecting everybody, which is essentially what this industry is. So I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you guys so much for your time. And I hope to see you guys soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.